Welcome to the first Sunday show of 2026, the first NdB Sunday show, so named in honor of the late Neil de Beer, who was a regular and a Biz News favorite. Today, my guest is Energy Expert Roland Tatnall. Welcome.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for having me on the show.
You being an oil fundi, you can tell us, why is the United States so obsessed with, why has it become so obsessed with Venezuelan oil?
So I think there are three reasons. The first is geopolitical. Obviously, at the end or beginning of December, the end of last year, the U.S. administration released its national security strategy, and in that it revived an old geopolitical doctrine called the Monroe Doctrine from the early 19th century, where the idea is that the US has an interest to manage, if not control, its hemisphere, and its hemisphere is defined as the Americas, effectively. So Canada, the US, obviously, and Latin America. So geopolitically, it fits right in with that idea. The Venezuelan government has been since the Chavez period in the late 90s antagonistic to the US government. And then the second reason is probably a little bit of resentment or anger. There was a raft of nationalizations and what have been deemed expropriations from US oil companies in 2007, 8, 9, where the US oil companies were required to take on the Venezuelan National Oil Company as a large shareholder in their projects. They refused to. They considered it an expropriation. They exited the country, and those assets were then nationalized. So I think that combination of antagonism towards the US, that this administration doesn't seem to take too well to antagonism towards its administration from foreign governments, and the expropriation of what were considered US assets, certainly fed into the story, I think. And then the third thing, and probably what's been given most column inches, is the strategic aspect of the oil itself. So Venezuela is a significant oil reserve base. It's got 20% of the entire world's known reserves, 300 billion barrels. Those barrels are heavy oil. Not all oil is created equal. It's heavy oil. We can maybe talk about that a little bit later. And it was at one point a significant producer of oil. In the late 90s, it was producing over 3 million barrels of oil a day, which was about 5% of total global production. It was projected to ramp up to about 6.5 million barrels per day during the mid-noughties. But because of the transition to the Chavez regime, the opposite happened, and its oil industry has become fairly decrepit, and it's been producing less than 1 million barrels per day recently. So strategically, it's a significant potential player in the world, and combined with the other two realities within the administration. Maybe the resentment bit isn't so much a reality, it's more a feeling, but I think it sort of fits into the playbook of what the administration is looking to do. Strategically also, you've had strategically and geopolitically, you've had China showing increased interest in Latin America, and you've seen the Trump administration be antagonistic towards that. So you've seen it with Panama and leveraging the Chinese investments into Panama, the Panamanian port companies out, and trying to lever American port companies and investors in. And China was also taking up to 80% of that crude that Venezuela was producing, the heavy crude that it was producing. So all of those points, I think, feed into the narrative of the US having a particular interest in Venezuela and its crude.
Talking about the Chinese, they paid in Chinese yuan, did they not, and not in US dollars. Could that have been a currency motive in addition to the US's other agenda?
Yeah, I mean, it might be a subplot. I don't think it's one of the primary reasons. So Venezuela was selling China discounted oil to pay back some of its debt. And yes, the transactions were done in the renminbi or the yuan. But it's such a small part of the global oil trade that it is less than 1% now, that it probably doesn't have. It's not. I wouldn't have thought it would be at the forefront of the rationale for what happened over the weekend.
So if US companies invest billions to develop the oil fields, what impact would that have on global demand and supply?
Yeah, so if investment flows to sort of rebuild the oil sector in Venezuela, it's not going to have an immediate impact. I mean, the oil fields are producing at low rates compared to what they were and what they potentially could produce at. As I said, about less than 1 million barrels a day. So 1 million barrels a day is less than 1% of global oil demand or consumption at the moment. So any increase in that isn't going to have a significant short-term impact on supply and demand in the global context. If you're thinking over the next sort of decade, 15 years or so, of pushing oil exports up to 3, 4, 5 million barrels of oil a day, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about how to get to 3 million barrels, back up to 3 million barrels of oil a day. But as I said, the ambition for Venezuela in the noughties was to get to over 6 million barrels of oil a day. But if that's to happen over the next 10 to 15 years, then it will be a slow process. It's not going to be a quick process. And the pricing of oil is often managed by OPEC anyway. So if there's an increase of 2 or 3 million barrels over the next decade plus, then either demand is likely to sort of offset that, or OPEC will manage that to manage the pricing. So I don't think it's going to have nothing's going to happen tomorrow. If anything, the oil industry could become more dysfunctional in the short term, until the geopolitical situation has sort of calmed down a little bit, and everyone knows how the existing investments are going to be managed by the country, before larger investments are made by the majors or the multinationals. I think one thing to consider as well is that the majors aren't. I mean, no one's going to invest billions of dollars in the country tomorrow. It's got a terrible history for oil and gas companies. It is and obviously it's not a stable regime. The vice president who was sworn in is avowedly anti-American as well, in terms of not anti-American people, but anti the American imperialist regime as they see it. And so there have to be some kind of support for anyone who's going to make an investment in that country, especially US companies, and that will probably be in the form of US government guarantees on investments made. And strong legal documentation is going to have to be drafted and agreed in order for oil companies to invest considerable sums in the country, and that will obviously take time. So none of this is going to happen in the very near term.
Tell us about the quality of oil there, because I understand that the 30 to 50 million barrels that America is getting or taking is heavy crude and needs specialist refineries to pump.
Yeah. So oil, not all oil is created equal. Yeah. So fundamentally, um, the two most important sort of aspects, or when simply looking at quality of crude oil, is its heaviness, its density, and its viscosity, and then what it contains, its levels of sulfur, heavy metals, and so on and so forth. Um, and the Venezuelan oil is typically, nearly all of it, the vast majority of it is heavy to extremely heavy crude, which puts it right at the top of the density spectrum, and it's also very viscous. So if you consider that the West Texas Intermediate, which is sort of onshore US oil, is relatively light, and then Brent crude, which is another index that is used to trade oil, is also relatively light. Most of West African's oil is light. Canadian oil is heavy, and Venezuela's heavy. And what that means is it takes more dollars per barrel to extract and more dollars per barrel to process. Having said that, it's it's necessary. Yeah. So the light stuff, when it passes through the refineries, and refineries, I should add, are built specifically for heavy or light crude, much in the same way that coal-fired power stations are, in South Africa and elsewhere, have been built for specific grades of coal. So the light stuff produces the lighter distillates, such as petrol or gasoline, as in the US, and jet fuel. And the heavy stuff produces diesel and fuel oils and heavy fuel oils, and asphalt as well. So it's a necessary oil, but it does tend to be more costly to produce and to refine. And if you look at a cost curve, the Venezuelan, in terms of production of new oil from Venezuela, it will be right at the sort of far end of the cost curve, just below the Canadian tar sands, which are the most expensive to produce. So economically, it's not the most attractive in a low oil price environment, which we have at the moment, necessarily to invest in new greenfield heavy crude production, exploration and production. Having said that, the existing oil fields are obviously already producing, and the cost of that production is significantly less than new production. So yeah, there's a balance there. There's effectively, if you're looking to enter the country and take over, as it were, and improve the production of the country's oil, you would first look to improve what you have producing already. So you would look to improve that throughput. You would then look to add some brownfield investments, so adjacent investments, and only after that you'd look to sort of add greenfield investments, which will be the most expensive.
Looking at these developments purely from an investment point of view, out of 10, how many points would you give US President Donald Trump for it?
Sorry, out of 10, what would I give?
US President Donald Trump, purely from an investment point of view.
Oh, out of 10. I wouldn't like to quantify it, but as I say, it will be a challenge for any company that has shareholders. I mean, a private company, privately owned company, is a slightly different thing, but any company that has shareholders to justify an investment in somewhere like Venezuela, in something like heavy crude at the moment, I would have thought. The oil industry is starting to sort of pare back on capital investments, particularly in the areas of the cost curve that are the highest, so the highest end of the cost curve, such as ultra deep water and other places. So yeah, I think it would be a challenge to convince shareholders that investing billions of dollars into Venezuelan heavy oil greenfield production would be a good investment at this moment.
Now, meanwhile, fuel prices in South Africa are lower than they have been for a really long time. Is that likely to last?
Yeah, well, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? So the fuel price is obviously driven by the exchange rate with the dollar and the price of crude. And crude is has been decreasing. It's now, I think Brent is around $60 a barrel. It was at the start of the last year, 2025. It was $80 a barrel. West Texas is around 56. So, and it has decreased quite significantly over the last few months. So that's the one reason why pump prices are lower, and the other reason is that the dollar has softened and the rand has firmed against the dollar. And so long as those two stay in lockstep, then you can expect fuel prices to remain roughly where they are. If either one of them moves, then obviously prices will change. And we know that the rand's quite volatile, so we don't know where that's going to go. And the $56 a barrel for $56 to $60 a barrel is quite low, and there's questions on how sustainable that is. Going back to the Trump administration, Trump has repeatedly mentioned a sort of a target to get to $50 a barrel, which would obviously improve pump prices further for South Africa. But that's really sort of biting off the hand that feeds him, because much of the US onshore oil is not viable at that level. So onshore shale oil, which provides much of, I think about 9 million out of 13 million barrels per day that's produced is shale oil, has a break-even price for new wells of between sort of $60 and $65 a barrel. So pushing the price much lower doesn't make a lot of sense from the Trump administration's perspective, I would have thought. But obviously, he doesn't have all the levers on where the oil price goes.
I mean, well, China, Norway, and some other countries have been massively embracing electric vehicles. When will that start having an impact on the demand for oil?
Well, it has. It has already. I think the number that I read out of China is that the shift to electrification in China has removed 1 million barrels of oil a day from Chinese demand. Obviously, in parts of Europe, EV uptake has been significant. I think in Norway, some 95% of new cars sold are electric vehicles. But yeah, the rest of the world, I think, is in a slightly different place. I think there's still a lot needs to be done. There's three things that need to happen for EV uptake. This is effectively a technological shift. Yeah, so you have to persuade the consumer that this is the right move, and for that to happen, the price has to be right, the charging infrastructure has to be there, and the price of electricity has to be right as well. So until all those things are in lockstep, I think there's going to be a challenge in the rest of the world for EV uptake to be really significant. Although the shift does seem to be happening, even in South Africa.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you about South Africa. When do you think South Africa will be ready, if ever?
Well, again, it's those three things that are critical for any economy to sort of, or customer base to move over to EVs from combustion engines. I think the other thing that you have in South Africa, not necessarily all emerging markets, but in South Africa compared to Europe, is that we tend to drive longer distances here, and we have long distances to travel, whether it's on vacation or even to work. So there is that range anxiety, which I think is somewhat unfounded, but you do still need a significant charging infrastructure for people to be comfortable that they can get where they need to get to. We've also, if you're relying on the electricity system as well, obviously we've had two issues in South Africa recently. One being the reliability of the system itself, load shedding, able to access electricity, and the second being significant tariff increases. And we know that Eskom has now said that it's done with load shedding. We'll see whether that's actually the case over the next few years, but and it's going to focus on improving its cost base and not having to force through such great tariff increases. But again, I think that might be a little bit of a challenge. So you need both of those things to be fairly consistent for people to invest in new technology that relies on the electricity system.
Lastly, are there any misunderstandings surrounding these latest events that you can clear up or wish to clear up, points you wish to make?
In Venezuela in particular.
Mm.
Yeah, so I don't. I think a lot is being discussed now, and there's a lot of conspiracy theories around. I've seen some crazy ideas about the US's interest in Venezuela, um, but the I think that the address that was given by the president on Saturday, um, the president and his senior team, uh, was a little bit, um, not necessarily ill thought through, but I think some of the ambitions in that address were not particularly realistic, and we've touched on them a little bit. I think controlling and managing the oil is and developing that oil industry in that particular country is going to be a challenge, and it's going to take time. Um, Controlling, managing, buying and selling existing production and inventory is obviously a slightly different thing. That's much easier, and I think that's where the US administration will put its focus on at the moment. You talked about the 50 million barrels. Is producing 1 million barrels a day, give or take. China has now been effectively totally shut out from taking that oil, and it's effectively in the US's hands. But increasing that production and um, uh, uh, making a big difference to the oil industry on the ground is going to take time, and I think that's something that we should all bear in mind.
Oh, also, uh, any predictions for the future of the oil industry?
Well, it's not going anywhere soon. Obviously, I'm heavily. My first career was in oil exploration, and I'm heavily involved in renewables now. And I think the hope and the expectation was that the oil industry, by a large proportion of the public, and governments, was that the oil industry would decline somewhat. But it's clear that it's not going anywhere soon. Oil demand continues to increase. There have been investments in new fields, especially including in countries that were very sort of climate centric, like Norway. So the oil industry is going to continue to um, uh, prosper for a while yet, I would say. Whether or not we're going to reach peak demand, which has been talked about for decades now, in the coming years, I wouldn't like to forecast, but that 100 million barrels a day of oil or so that the world is consuming at the moment is not going to fall drastically over the next few years, I wouldn't have thought.
Thank you. That was energy expert Roland Tatnall on the NdB Sunday Show with me, Steyn. Thank you.